Condé Nast is a name you've probably heard because of their ownership of Vogue. But 150 years ago, Condé Nast was actually a real person. In fact, he was the one who changed the face of publishing forever by literally inventing the way we consume editorial media today. And yet, even with that accolade under his belt, he was so much more. This is the story of Condé Nast. This video is sponsored by Coopert. It's a web browser plugin that's custom built to save you money. Firstly, you can use it as a price comparison service, but it's mostly useful as a coupon finder, pulling sources from around the web and auto-applying it to your checkout for websites like Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein, and even eBay, though it is supported by 3 million different retailers. It ran 16 different coupons for my eBay here for me, and though none of them stuck, instead I received about 1% in cashback, which does add up over time, especially if you add to that the savings one can make on groceries, because this extension even supports Lidl, Sainsbury's, and for the Americans, Walmart. Coopert supports Chrome, Edge, Opera, Firefox, and Safari on desktop, and also Safari on mobile. With over 6 million weekly active users on desktop and 3 million weekly active users on mobile, basically, it's a no-brainer way to save you money for free. So to try Coopert for yourself today, click on the link in the description to install it to your browser, and thank you again for Coopert for sponsoring this video. Condé Montrose Nast was born in New York City on March 26, 1873, as the son of William Frederick Nast and Esther Ariadne Benoit, whose marriage in 1868 was contentious due to religious differences. You see, William's father, Wilhelm Nast, was known as the father of Methodism in the US, and importantly to our story, was the founder of a very important magazine on Methodism called Der Christliche Apologet or Der Christliche Apologet, depending on the source. He had a significantly negative impact on William for his strict anti-Catholic upbringing, which resulted in him rebelling massively, exchanging religion for an unquenchable thirst for money. This ultimately led to his marriage to the Catholic and very rich Esther Benoit. Or at least that's what he thought, because while it is true that Esther's family had old and established wealth worth $300,000 or about $3.6 million today, it was split between 15 children. It wasn't enough for William, and so he abandoned his wife and 3 young children in 1876 in the hope of making his fortune in Europe. As a result, Esther, who was unable to work being that she was a woman in the 1800s, and her children had to move to her family's St. Louis mansion, where Condé, their youngest son, was raised solely by women. It's thought that it's this that fostered an understanding towards women, which would later inform his own publishing. Soon, he attended St. Louis State Schools from 1877, and it became clear that his personality was shy but detail-focused, with a good mix of mathematical and visual skills. But frankly, there was nothing inherent to his childhood that indicated that Condé would find success later in life, and in fact most books just describe him as rather unremarkable. He, in this sense, was set for a mundane life. At least that was until 1890, when William Nast disappointingly returned from Europe, having failed to achieve his fortune. His sister Fanny called him Mr. Disappointment and stepped in with an offer that the family could not refuse. Fanny was William's youngest sister, who had made her fortune by marrying William Alexander Gamble, the son of James Gamble, founder of Procter & Gamble. As such, philanthropy was a large part of her life, so in 1890 she decided it was her duty to help Esther in the face of her disappointing husband. Fanny would send one of her sons to university, but only one, and Esther had 2, Condé and his older brother Louis. Because of their age, it was obvious that Louis was going to be the one sent to university. However, quote, Fanny went to visit the Nasts in St. Louis, and on walking up the path to the house, observed 2 patches of garden, one tidy and the other disorganized. "Whose is that?" she asked. The messy garden, it turned out, was the responsibility of Louis. Condé's garden was the immaculate one. "Then I'm not educating that boy," Fanny said, pointing to the elder brother. "I'm educating Condé." Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this story is true. It's much more likely that it was Condé's donation to the Parnell Defense Fund in 1889 that convinced her, but regardless, Condé was the one chosen to attend Georgetown University in 1891. Wounded, his older brother Louis moved to Paris and never saw Condé nor his family again. Condé, meanwhile, transformed at university. Within his first year alone, Nast became the first student president of the university's athletic association ever, taking over the scheduling, finances, promotion, and fundraising for all of their athletic teams. He also took charge of the tennis association and managed the baseball team, despite not really being sporty himself. But instead of that, this was in pursuit to become the most popular student among them all. And it worked. In his second year, he won multiple tennis titles himself, again despite not being particularly sporty, and became associate editor of the Journal, which was Georgetown's student newspaper. Here, Condé worked alongside Robert J. Collier, who, despite beating Nast out to become the editor-in-chief in 1984, became an inseparable friend to Nast. So close, in fact, that when Condé's father died in 1983, Robert signed the letter of condolence in the Journal. By the time Condé graduated, he received a distinction in rational philosophy and mathematics, delivered the bachelor's oration, and stayed on to do a master's, graduating in 1895. Though this was without Robert, who actually went to do his master's at Harvard and Oxford University before going to work in his father's publishing company in 1897. During this same time, Condé undertook a Bachelor of Laws at Washington University, but he didn't like it. He all but checked out, finding himself more interested in a local printing plant that his family had invested $2,000 in. The press was failing, and they needed some kind of help. But to Nast, the solution seemed simple. Quote, he quickly made up a list of all the exhibitors from the Middle West and South who would need small printing jobs done in connection with their displays at the upcoming St. Louis Exposition and offered them an advertising and marketing deal with the printing plant. It was an enormous success. It saved the company. But best of all, Robert Collier had arrived in town just in time to see his success. Robert Collier's father owned a particularly large publishing company that spanned all of magazines, encyclopedias, and newspapers. On the recommendation of Robert, his father hired Condé Nast for $12 a week, which is just shy of $500 a week today, to be part of the staff of Collier's Weekly in New York City. Collier's Weekly was their most successful mass-market magazine, with one of the largest circulations of any American weekly at the time. And yet, it was amateurly put together. There was no contents page, hefty pages of solid text, and all the advertising relegated to the back 2 pages. It had a declining readership, and Collier's worried for the future of the magazine. This is where Condé came in. Robert Collier had a new vision for the magazine, and it was his job to realize it and to improve it to something actually desirable. Together, their idea was to modernize the topics and make it more of a social magazine. They hired better illustrators, better journalists, better writers of fiction, and raised the price from 7 to 10 cents. All Condé had to do was take that idea and sell it to advertisers. It was a massive hit, and by 1900, Nast was advertising manager of the entire magazine. He was the hard-working, talented man that had made his family proud. All he had left to find was a romantic partner. And he didn't have to wait too long. In 1902, he was introduced to Jean-Clarice Coudert at a riding weekend in New Jersey by Robert Collier. They were besotted. He could promise her adventure, and she was an heiress to a multi-million-dollar fortune from a large legal company called the Coudert Brothers. Plus, she was also part of the Social Register, which was a list of the top names in high society. At this time, when America was cultivating its own class system based on how much money was in one's bank account, this was a huge deal. They were wed within the year on the 19th of August 1902 in St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York, and Condé, his siblings, and his mother were all added to the 1902 Social Register. And yet, not everything was rosy. As it was already on their honeymoon, Condé and Clarice knew it wouldn't work out. They had so much going for them. Condé was very paternal, and actually he did have the money to spoil his already spoiled bride, but it was clear from early on that, quote, intimations of disaster were apparent. Regardless, this was 1902, and both were from religious families, so divorce was not an option. They moved into their first marital home on 66 West 11th Street that year, and by the 23rd of July 1903, their first child, Charles Condé Nast, was born. They would move 7 more times over the next 15 years, most of which are undocumented. I won't be telling you about them. Meanwhile, at work, Condé had had somewhat of a revelation. Their magazine, much like all the magazines at the time, were mass market, which meant that they targeted everyone, and therefore, a good portion of the time, the adverts that had paid to be there were falling on deaf ears. Condé proposed that they aim for one target market distinctly in order to better meet the needs of specialized advertisers, which was quite a daring idea for the time, to choose to explicitly exclude most people. Of course, Robert Collier got it and actually thought the idea was brilliant, but Collier's Weekly was far too down the rabbit hole of who they were already defined as to be able to change. The advertising was the backbone of the magazine, and a major change to the magazine would risk just too many jobs for too many people. Instead, they decided to do a Collier's special number in which 1 or 2 issues would have dedicated topics, while the rest would just remain as they were, almost like a test run. Simultaneously to this, and to the birth of his first son, Nast also had a third avenue of interest. Thanks to 3 investors who were to become the company's first directors, Condé had invested in a company called the Home Pattern Company, who manufactured and published sewing patterns. Here, Condé also tried to work his advertising muscles by connecting companies to, effectively, already a well-targeted publication. It did okay, but because their publication was a free magazine, likely to just be thrown away, it proved difficult as a sale to advertisers anyway. Soon, their second child, Natica, on the 5th of January 1905, was born, and this came alongside with a bump in his salary as he was promoted to business manager of Collier's in 1905. Not that he nor his family massively needed it, as by this point Nast was already paid $40,000 a year, which is the equivalent of about $1.5 million in 2025, just from his job alone, let alone his other investments. It's with this money, however, that he would enter negotiations to buy Vogue in 1905. The sale didn't go through, but it showed his tenacity to grow his empire, reinvesting everything he had back into his business. But perhaps the sale not going through was for the best at this time, as only a couple of months after that, in 1906, Clarice came down with hysteria, which required her to need the help of Cora Jane Richards, or Dickie, who was supposed to live in with the family to help her medically. However, it was at this time Clarice decided that she simply had to go to Paris to pursue an operatic career and whisked her children away, as well as Dickie, from their father, leaving Condé completely alone. He was truly devastated. Condé was exceptionally close to his children, and he was basically left with nothing overnight, only with his career. And that was soon to be up in flames. Literally. In 1907, the Home Pattern Company's neighbour, William Green, caught on fire, and it spread to their building. It took 3 hours and the water of a nearby river to put out the fire, which spread across the street into the Home Pattern Company's building. Luckily, the manager saved their most valuable pattern, so losses were at a minimum, but the fire was devastating nonetheless. It was so bad, in fact, that Condé quit his high-paying role at Collier's to focus on his own business to bring it back to where it once was. He devised a new advertising department and implemented the niche targeting idea that he had tried to implement at Collier's into his own business. However, just as he was in the midst of implementing all of these new changes, Dickie appeared back in New York with his children, complaining that Clarice was neglecting them both. Condé could not have been happier. His children were back, he was very fond of Dickie, who would be his new live-in nanny, and his business was about to seriously take off thanks to his new idea of pattern grading being printed on the pattern paper. If you sew, you know how ridiculously important this development is, but essentially, he had the forethought to realize that not every woman is a size 36 US, and not every woman loves to do all the maths herself to make her projects suit her size. So this was brilliant for the consumer by printing individually drafted sizes both up and down from the standard American 36. Needless to say, this was a runaway success. It's still printed today, in fact. It immediately turned the company around. They had to implement a national sales team to sell to large stores, individuals, and advertisers because it was so successful, and it began to show up their closest competition in Vogue patterns, who now looked outdated. Truthfully, his career could not have been going any better by 1908 than it was. His home life too was seemingly perfect. He had a new home, a townhouse on Gramercy Park. He had 2 children whom he was incredibly close to. He had language governesses so his children could grow up trilingual with German, French, and English, and a nanny whom he was very, very, very fond of. Unfortunately, however, the same fondness for Dickie was not found in Clarice, who, when she returned in 1908, despite the begging of her children, sent Dickie away, firing her from her role. She would only be permitted to return if the children were sick. But this was quite selfish too, because Clarice found she just didn't enjoy New York anyway, and would from this moment on actively try to spend as long as possible out of the country, to the tune of 6 months plus out of the year, sometimes even dragging their children begrudgingly along with her, giving them quite negative memories of their mother. She ended up becoming a very stark contrast to their warm, stable, and very loving father. This brings us to 1909, at which time Arthur Baldwin Turner, who was the founder of Vogue, had been passed away for 3 years, dying of pneumonia in 1906 at only 49 years old. His sister-in-law, Marie Harrison, had been left in charge with the then assistant by the name of Edna Woolman Chase, and Vogue was in a particularly bad place. But obviously Condé knew how to fix it. And now, finally, after 4 years of negotiation, they were ready to sell. His initial changes were extremely subtle, however. He mostly just wanted to watch for several months to know how they operated before later implementing his series of what he presumed would be his changes, including inviting new paper, better quality paper, better writers, better photographers, better layouts, better printing, a new art director, and most importantly, a laser focus on who the magazine was intended for. He wrote, quote, "As a matter of fact, the publisher, the editor, the advertising manager, and circulation man must conspire not only to get all their readers from the one particular genre to which the magazine is dedicated, but rigorously to exclude all others." Condé Nast underlined those last 3 words. He knew unequivocally that by targeting one group explicitly, he could be the best, the first, and the only choice for his target market. And it worked. His CPM, which is the rate at which some adverts are priced, went up to 5 times that of his competitors because every reader of Vogue would be interested in what they were selling. He made the magazine more desirable to advertisers and to readers in that sense. They actively wanted to see adverts that related to them personally and were encouraged to engage with the brands thusly. Quite literally, it was the first magazine to consider 3 points of interest: the magazine, the reader, and the advertiser, in total tandem, and all 3 benefited from it. Vogue was an overnight success. Its subscription had doubled, and its newsstand sales had tripled. The home patent company, too, was seeing improvements with revenue up to $180,000 in 1909. However, outside of the consumer-facing improvements, a major part of their success was that, firstly, he was on the social register thanks to Clarice, which did give him massively big access to the New York elite, whom he would feature in the magazines. And second, because he began to throw incredible parties. Frankly, Condé Nast was no Great Gatsby. Parties were not his idea of fun, and even at his own parties, he would mostly just be in another room playing bridge alone and not drinking. That said, they were a vital part of his and Vogue's ascension into higher society. He needed his name to be associated with the right kinds of people. He needed Vogue to be associated with the right kinds of people. Condé was on top of the world yet again. By March 1911, he expanded his growing empire with the partial acquisition of House and Garden and Travel, then a short while later with The Housekeeper, all of which owned 50-50 with his friend Robert Collier. The Housekeeper was closed the following year, probably because it was purchased only for its subscription list, but also in 1912, Vogue began to sell in England, American Vogue, of course. By 1913, Nast bought the magazine House and Garden in full, buying his shares off of Robert Collier, and he also bought the magazines Dress and Vanity Fair, the latter of the two which he merged to create the very creatively named Dress and Vanity Fair that September. However, 1913 was also the year an exceptionally wealthy man named William Randolph Hearst took over Harper's Bazaar, then spelled with one A, and would try to use it to compete with Vogue, poaching its writers, photographers, and staff with their unlimited funds. Quote, in 1913, the battle lines were uncompromisingly drawn when Harper's Bazaar advertised itself as the first magazine published for women of the upper class, the others are published at them. Hearst was very competitive, and because of this, it would repeatedly impact both Condé's personal and professional lives. It certainly also did not help that on the 1st of February 1914, a legal battle saw that Mary Harrison was forced to leave her editorship at Vogue, leaving Edna Woolman Chase, her assistant, to take over as editor-in-chief. Dress and Vanity Fair, too, was also not doing as expected, so Frank Crowninshield was brought on to save it, removing the word dress and the ampersand from its title and retargeting the magazine to a more intellectual slant. Previously, it was more like a gossip rag. These two individuals would be Condé's closest friends and most trusted employees, paramount to his success at surviving through Hearst's competitive nature. I think it's probably also worth pointing out at this stage that Condé personally knew almost nothing about sport or fashion or art or decorating, basically any of the topics that any of his magazines like House and Garden, Vogue and Vanity Fair covered. And instead, he just became a very talented boss for hiring the people that knew better than him and leaving them to create conducive environments of their own. If the magazines were financially successful and not causing a problem, he pretty much just left them well alone. To be honest, I'm actually considering doing videos on both Vogue and Vanity Fair in the future, so I'll leave the smaller details about how they transformed them for that, but there are two things that we probably should talk about. Firstly, it's that House and Garden was combined with another magazine called Homes and Garden in 1915. And secondly, around the same time, Condé met a man named Lucien Vogel, who was a member of the Chambre syndicale de la couture, and he would become a lifelong friend and Condé's doorway into the world of French publishing, quickly putting the idea of publishing in France into his head. Perhaps even a French Vogue. But there was one glaring problem. World War I had begun in July 1914, and yet it didn't stop Condé from thinking that 1915 was a great time to co-launch with his new friend Lucien Vogel in French publishing by reintroducing the Gazette du Bon Ton, which had already been published but was pausing publication due to the war. Together, they changed it to basically be the same thing as American Vogue, just with Lucien's connections and making it very, very highbrow for the French audience. But it took so long to implement and test these changes during the war that the paper stayed dormant for the remainder of it, only resurfacing in 1919 after both the war had finished, that British Vogue had launched in 1916, and in 1918 Vogue expanded into Spain, both of which though to no initial success. Regardless, this certainly wasn't where Condé's main focus was over these years anyway, as it marked the end of his union with Clarice. They couldn't really divorce because of the cultural norms at the time, but both finally agreed to date other people openly, though they were kind of doing that anyway, especially with Condé, who had become known to date the opera singer Grace Moore. However, because she was famous, it did end up causing some humiliation for Clarice, which is what caused her to circumvent the humiliation by physically removing her from the situation. She moved out of their last apartment together, which is 470 Park Avenue, and moved into another apartment not too far away at 1000 Park. This led to Condé spending more time dating other women much more openly. Quote, "Some were actresses, some were models, some were debutantes. Most had some connection with his magazine, which provided an enchanting and ever-refillable pool. Some were hired for temporary assignments, others were brought in by Nast himself. He was in the habit of meeting some pretty thing at a party in New York or Newport and inviting her to work for Vogue. A resigned Edna Chase then had to find these charming amateurs jobs for the duration of her employer's infatuation. He always, without exception, responded to a pretty face." He basically dated Leonardo DiCaprio style even until his later years, with few women from here making any kind of impact on his life, largely because these were young women with whom he had absolutely nothing in common, especially as he got older, and he realized that women were just not interested in him, but instead were interested in what a free meal with the famous Condé Nast would look like, especially if they knew he was easy to give away jobs at Vogue. Quote, "The office itself was, in effect, both an escort service and a feudal village, with Nast possessing droit de seigneur. Any unmarried woman drifting down the corridor was fair game." However, while I tell you this, it's important to remember that he was still very progressive for his time. This is the early 1900s, and his staff were nearly all women, even in executive roles. All employees also had the possibility of career progression, and all were often paid and even given bonuses generously for the time. But this was still a different time, and unfortunately this kind of sexualized office behavior was unfortunately totally normal then, especially coming out of World War I, when unmarried copulation was becoming more normalized. Another very important development post-World War I, perhaps more important, was the launch of French Vogue, finally, in 1919. However, much like Spanish Vogue and much like British Vogue, it was also not profitable, but instead it was important as it connected all of Condé Nast magazines directly to French fashion houses, which made Condé Nast's magazine empire look good, using that very valuable tool of perception that Condé was already implementing in New York with his ongoing parties and had been implementing while he was at university as well. That French Vogue was perfect for pushing American Vogue into the roaring 20s. The 20s, in that sense, were one of the most impactful decades in Condé Nast's life. But the decade started off incredibly strong just in the year 1920 alone, including 1. The Gazette du Bon Temps returned to newsstands in France. 2. They launched an American version of the Gazette du Bon Temps. However, after 4 issues and a copyright disagreement, it was renamed to the Gazette du Bon Genre. Number 3. French Vogue debuted their first issue on the 15th of June 1920. 4. The Vogels magazine, called L'Illustration, folded, so Condé bought it and rebranded it to Jardin de Mode to near immediate success. 5. He began giving his estranged wife Clarice an annual income of $10,000, which is just shy of $160,000 as of 2025. 6. He launched a British version of House and Garden. It wasn't successful, folded in 3 years. 7. Condé Nast was formally recognized for his progressive employment. He had only 2 men in high management at the time in the US, Frank Crowninshield of Vanity Fair and Richardson Wright in House and Garden. Nast would later, in 1937, actually win an award for this, but it was acknowledged in 1920 because his competitors gave statements to say it wasn't safe for women to be entrusted with executive roles, while Nast instead printed, quote, "Nothing that we can say is too clever for you." 2008, Prohibition was begun in the US, so all of his magazines lost a ton of money in advertising, but it didn't stop the alcohol at his personal parties, which still flowed freely. And 9, he defended several openly gay employees, like Dorothy Todd, editor-in-chief of British Vogue, the photographer Baron Adolphe de Meyer, and Vogue and Vanity Fair contributor John McMullen. This extends to also in 1920, with rising anti-Semitism and racism in America, he would invite his black Jewish friend Jack Dempsey to become the sports editor of Vanity Fair in an incredibly risky but yet important step for Condé Nast at this time, cementing his employees, regardless of their background, as the best of the best. This last point, however, did begin rumors that he himself was gay with his Vanity Fair editor-in-chief Frank Crowninshield, but it's largely considered tabloid fodder today, as there is significantly more evidence of women that he dated. But this rumor was prevalent at the time, especially because Nast didn't love his serial dating of women being public knowledge. In fact, now that he was becoming famous of himself, he would grow an anxiety about how his serial dating would reflect on himself and his magazine. He started to really suffer with serious anxiety. Simultaneously, as these rumors were increasing in quantity, his main printing company actually went bankrupt in the US, and it led to him acquiring the company in its entirety in 1921, beginning Condé Nast Publications' vertical integration into printing, cutting costs, and streamlining the supply chain greatly. However, because this printing press was specialized in mass market magazines, he soon needed to expand on this with another, far smaller printing company in Connecticut, which was far newer and as such housed significantly more modern printing technology, thus becoming his most prized company because of his own love of printing and photography. So while he knew almost nothing about art and sport and fashion, this was his gig. Over the next few months, perhaps years, it's a bit unclear, he spent an astonishing amount of money turning this Connecticut printing plant into effectively the Google headquarters of its time. He hired 2 top landscape architects of the time named Guy Lowell and Ferruccio Vital to transform the space into a $350,000, which is just over $6.2 million today, monument to his company's achievements. It was 300,000 square feet of floor space, full of extremely modern printing technology and full of highly trained, skilled craftsmen and deliverymen set to take the postal logistics in-house as well. There was a huge driveway laced with trees, huge lawns, gardens, monoliths, and podiums bearing his name and the company's name. It became the pièce de résistance of the publishing world and was so big that it could house not only the printing for his own magazines, but also for his competitors, including in later years The New Yorker, Field & Stream, Scientific American, Modern Photography, and Mademoiselle. It quickly became the single thing that he was most proud of in his entire career. He hosted parties here for staff, indiscriminate of where the employee sat on the business hierarchy, even taking literal royalty around the grounds, and far more importantly, also taking his children and later his grandchildren to see the grounds and to see the plaque where their name stood. This was also a huge point of pride for Edelman Chase, who, besides Condé himself, was now the highest-ranking person in the magazine, and importantly was the one to suggest the hiring of Carmel Snow in 1921. In fact, Chase was so fiercely loyal to Nast that she'd refused a doubling of her salary to move to their rival Harper's Bazaar, an offer which was not refused by everyone. By 1922, Condé had moved in with Frank Crowninshield, which did not help the rumors, but fortunately, it was at this same time that his relationship with Grace Moore went public, giving the papers just a different kind of scandal to report on. Infidelity, which did shield him somewhat from the homosexuality rumors. However, shortly after this, right as British Vogue was finally picking up, Condé Nast became gravely ill. Double pneumonia, a condition that in 1923 could kill a man. Condé almost died. It was so close, in fact, that Clarice, his wife, whom he had not seen in years, rushed to England to be by his deathbed. Months he laid in bed, hoping to make a recovery, while unbeknownst to him, British Vogue was going to pot thanks to a man named Albert Lee, who was their very incompetent business manager. Without Nast, nobody had the authority to fire him. So when his recovery did eventually come in 1924, it was duly welcomed by his employees because not only was he back, but he'd weeded out an incompetent leader, firing him on the spot. Unfortunately, however, this was not the only issue that coincided with Nast's brush with death. On top of this, his estranged brother Louis was dying in France, and aside from the British version of House and Garden shutting down, his rival William Hearst would start to cause a real problem for Nast. You see, jealous of his ongoing success, without having really to spend the copious amount of money that he was, William Hearst, owner of Harper's Bazaar, began a smear campaign against Condé, actively lying in order to defame his competitor. In Hearst newspapers, he wrote, quote, "Vogue gives up idea of London edition. Condé Nast, editor and owner of Vogue, has abandoned his attempt to establish Vogue in London and has sold the English edition of Vogue to the publishing house of Hutchinson and Company. In this connection, it is interesting to note that all attempts to establish English editions of American editions have not failed. The English edition of Good Housekeeping, owned and published by William Randolph Hearst, has become, in 2 short years, the leading women's magazine in England." Obviously, this was completely poppycock, unfounded lies meant to defame Mr. Nast, but it did hurt his reputation quite notably, to the point that Condé Nast had to issue a rebuttal printed only a week later. A full-page spread in Printer's Ink, which was an American trade magazine not owned by Condé Nast, which read, quote, "This story, which appeared only in the Hearst newspapers throughout the country, is absolutely false. I have not sold and am not contemplating the sale of British Vogue to anyone. Condé Nast." It was the last time that Condé Nast ever responded publicly to Hearst in this way, despite Hearst continuing to try to defame Condé for many, many years to come. However, honestly, it didn't really seem to hurt Condé's reputation too much after this either, because after this initial feud, it just became obvious that Hearst was doing all of this out of spite. Besides, Condé was very far from being usurped for the top spot anyway. In fact, his career trajectory was still on an endless upwards projection after on the 6th of June 1923, the French government bestowed on Condé the Order of the Chevalier de Légion of Honor in recognition of his encouragement of French culture. The printing company then was expanded to incorporate both press and administration buildings, and even more money was put into the ongoing renovations to modernize the external appearance of the building itself with glass walls and pinewood floors. They even acquired a neighboring 22 acres of land on one side of Boston Post Road, Connecticut, and another 11 acres on the other side, totaling to 33 added acres of land around the building, which he lavishly decorated with semicircular driveways, 60 full-grown elm trees surrounding them, and more trees, shrubs, ferns, and flowers decorating tastefully some of the rest of the land. They had fountains, flower beds, Italian sculptures. He had local telephone wires embedded into the earth to not disrupt the eye line, with new lampposts erected as well. This was incredible, so incredible that people requested and even were granted permission to marry in the park, specifically under a statue of Cupid in the Georgian Love Temple garden. So incredible that finally his closest friends started to worry if he was spending just a little bit too much. But to Condé, at this point, it wasn't just improving efficiency or improving product quality that was top of matters. He was already the market leader, so instead, his motivator in this was for his company to be perceived as a great, mighty entity. Again, it was a return to the idea of perception is more powerful than reality. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Clarice's relationship with her then-boyfriend Victor Oñativia, whose full name was José Victorio Oñativia, was becoming increasingly serious. I believe he also had been married to a woman named Julia Blackwell Cushman at this time, with whom he had 2 children, but I'm not really sure if they were still really together and this was an affair, or if they were similarly separated. But at least it gave Clarice the allowance to finally divorce Condé without too much of a scandal. He did continue to pay her the $10,000 a year, however, regardless of their romantic status. and regardless of the fact that she had married another man. In the interim time of the divorce, firstly, Spanish Vogue finally folded, and secondly, the Vogue, Vanity Fair, House and Garden, and I believe the Vogue Patterns offices in New York were all moved into the Condé Nast printing plant in Connecticut, speeding up their supply chain immensely. Only the editorial and the advertising departments would remain in New York. Thirdly, they closed down the French publication, the Gazette du Bon Ton, and finally, Condé Nast moved into a brand new, lavish penthouse apartment on 1040 Park Avenue with long-term flatmate Frank Crowninshield. It was the finest home he had ever acquired, designed by the infamous Elsie de Wolfe. Quote, by 1924, the plans had been changed to accommodate a special apartment for Condé Nast, who decided, daringly, to use the roof for a spectacular entertaining space, cooled, he trusted, by lingering crosstown breezes. Nast's specially designed apartment had 10 entertaining rooms on the roof and a suite of sleeping and domestic rooms on the floor below. The 2 floors, connected by a main staircase, a glassed-in conservatory or solarium was added later, sometime between 1926 and 1928. Nast's penthouse reflected this enthusiasm. Louis XV furniture, upholstered in pale green damask, Chinese screens, Regent's needlepoint sofas, grisaille walls, gilt frame mirrors, Savonnerie rugs, organdy curtains, ceilings covered in silver tea paper. The floor of the solarium was made of a fascinating waxed blue-green slate laid in a random mosaic. Of course, there was the obligatory amusing touches too, the chaise percée in the mirrored penthouse powder room, for instance, which came from Gloria Swanson's apartment, or the trombley railing at the top of a small staircase, which Lord Birkenhead, 3 sheets to the wind at a party in his honour, mistook for the real thing. His subsequent tumble down the stairs was fortunately not fatal. The pièce de résistance of Miss de Wolfe's extravagant vision was the ballroom, which was decorated with an 18th century Shenlong wallpaper, salmon pink moire curtains edged with blue-green fringe, silver gauze under curtains trimmed with Chinese blue ribbon and silver banding, and a parquet floor made in France and laid by specially imported French workmen. Wonderful copy, all in all, for a spread in Vogue, where naturally photographs of the apartment ultimately appeared. And that, as far as Condé Nast was concerned, was the point. His 30-room duplex was not acquired to house his wife, divorced, or his children, both almost grown. A middle-aged bachelor hardly needed 30 rooms to play in, even if one of them boasted a Shenlong wallpaper. Nast's apartment was designed as a mise-en-scène, a production center for the publisher's creations. Like Jay Gatsby, he had created a palace of hospitality. Nast so appreciated the results that he did not change one thing in the many years he lived there. The parties to which she refers, in fact, were now being held every other Sunday and had become famous for their, thanks to prohibition, then illegal bathtubs full of whiskey, champagne, rye, scotch, gin, Bacardi rum, vermouth, brandy, sherry, anything and everything that his guests could possibly want, which obviously made the parties enormously more fun in their sense of scandal and abandon. The apartment was so perfect, in fact, to be used as a backdrop for his beloved photographers who needed space to shoot for his Vogue shoots and for his children to run around and enjoy as well. Quickly, Condé became known for his lavish lifestyle, incredibly generous demeanor, and for his social skills despite his clearly documented awkwardness. His ability to keep in contact with everybody in his life was admirable, and seemingly no one, from staff to friends, was ever intentionally forgotten. It was a trait that Edwina Prue, winner of the 1924 Patou American modeling competition, would never forget, as he would encourage her into an acting career in England and send her food baskets when she was a starving actor. However, all of this ended up having somewhat of a negative impact, as his continually growing sense of inadequacy was really beginning to seriously affect him personally. He grew even more shy and retiring, more meek in his personal life, and unconfident in his position in life, which is described as Seebohm in her biography as a social vertigo. The money he accrued could not buy him happiness. Even the final success of British Vogue, which had previously been losing money every year but was now profitable, just did nothing to turn him around. And instead, he ended up serial dating even more women that he knew were using him to get some kind of semblance of excitement. He did find pleasure this way, and he was more than willing to spend his money to engage with new people, but mostly it just brought him to one important conclusion: that he could only find true solace in his children. Collier had recently in fact got engaged to a woman named Charlotte Babcock Brown, so he was unable to visit very often, but it was fortunate for his well-being that in 1927, Natica, who was either now 21 or 22, would move out of her mother's apartment and into Condé's home at 1040 Park that he was still at this time sharing with Frank Crowninshield. And yet, Frank was not her only new flatmate. Instead, Natica was faced with a woman her own age that was dating her father, who expected Natica to refer to her as stepmother. I believe this was a woman named Leslie Foster, who had known both Condé and Natica in her own childhood, as Natica and Leslie were only 3 years apart, with Leslie being 3 years younger. Naturally, time had drifted them apart, but as Condé kept in contact with Leslie's parents, when she turned of age, he ended up taking a shine to her. Soon, she moved in, and Crowninshield moved out to make room for the couple. It was just another moving part of the whirlwind that was 1927, in which, I believe in chronological order, just to recap, Grace Moore was split with Condé so she could study in France. Condé continued serial dating. Leslie came to New York with her parents. Natica then moved into the penthouse. Frank moved out of the penthouse, and then on top of all of that, Leslie covertly got a job at Vogue against Condé's wishes. Fortunately, however, in spite of how obviously bizarre this all was, it actually didn't seem to negatively affect his relationship with his children. So, in that sense, he finally had it all. He had a great home life, a beautiful house, more money than he could ever possibly have dreamed of, wonderful children. In fact, his wealth was so mighty by this point that it was about to afford him the second greatest home in his life, second only in importance, naturally, as this home was quite significantly bigger. Likely built to one-up his rival William Hearst, who had also just built a mansion in the same area, Saint Point in Long Island, New Jersey, it was known as Sandy Key, a colossal mansion with multiple porches, terraces, formal gardens, a tennis court, a pool, which he remodeled several times before he landed on an oval shape, with an inside bathhouse and gardens that stretched to the beach. Obviously, because Nast spent the vast majority of his summers in Europe with Frank Crowninshield anyway, this home was actually just purpose-built for parties as well, just like his New York penthouse had been. Now with a remodeling cost of $750,000 or about $13.6 million in 2025, now he felt that he had it all. And it still wasn't enough. You see, I haven't exactly relayed everything that happened in 1927 just yet. This, in fact, was the year that his financial advisors, Wardell Catchings and Harrison Williams, who were closely connected with the leading stockbrokers Goldman Sachs and Company, Catchings was their president in fact, would advise him to list Condé Nast publications on the New York Stock Exchange. In March 1927, it listed as $28.50 per share and went up to $32 per share. He had made the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars in the space of a day. He reinvested all of that, save for what he spent on the house, into the business. But this was very, very badly advised. He should not have listed Condé Nast publications. You see, by 1927, the stock market was already showing very clear signs that its inflation could not be sustained, and his advisors would have known this explicitly. For a series of reasons too complicated to go into here, the entire stock market was artificially up, which led to freer bank lending, which would reinvest all of that into the already inflated stock market. $1.26 billion within just the last 6 months of 1927 alone, in fact, which is the equivalent of $23.5 billion today. This also included Condé as well. He got caught up in it. In the last few months of 1927, he was also advised by the same men to withdraw just over $2 million from the bank to take advantage of their newly low rates. Alternatively, however, he spent the money on updating the printing plant and was not part of the $1.26 billion loan for the stock market, but he still assumed that his current investment stock would help him earn that $2 million back within the 4-year repayment period, especially if he was using his loan to better his company. Unfortunately, what his advisors had failed to mention, however, was that other industries outside the stock market were not performing as the stock market was suggesting. The stock market had been inflating way past falling property prices, way past the falling construction industry, and way past the value of his own company. Quote, by January 1928, there was a general sentiment on Wall Street that stock prices had risen too high, too fast. At the same time, a lull was noted in the economy. Investment services ran ads asking, will you overstay the bull market? And is the process of deflation underway? Nast should have known this. He was being advised literally by the president of Goldman Sachs and Company, and it was very obvious to those in the know that the stock market could not sustain itself in the way that they were telling Nast it would. In fact, because of this, throughout 1928, Nast and his friends continued to reap the rewards of an inflated market, true in their belief that this would never end. In a flurry of emotion, he ended up proposing to his now 20-year-old girlfriend, Leslie Nast. But she wasn't sold initially. Throughout the beginning of 1928, Leslie was unsure if she was ready for marriage entirely. He was 55 years old, 4 years older than her father, and she was only 20 and a half. She did love him and he loved her, but she wasn't ready. In early 1928, she wrote to Condé a letter while he was away in Europe to break off the engagement and the relationship. Condé was distraught. Leslie was certainly not in the relationship for his money and had provided the same non-judgmental warmth that his children had been the sole provider of for so many years. He wrote her back immediately upon receiving the letter, only for it to find an equally distraught Leslie, who thoroughly regretted her first letter. She really did love him, and so the wedding ended up being back on. But that didn't mean her parents approved. Even Edna Woolman Chase, the ever the straight man, took her aside to dinner to discourage her from going through with the wedding. But by now, approval or disapproval, she was convinced, and their engagement remained. In the meantime, while they awaited their wedding, which they had not begun planning, Condé found himself in Germany, where Francis Walter Maas, the man behind British Vogue, had convinced him to open a German Vogue in April 1928, which did end up selling out its debut issue in 24 hours. It ended up becoming the creme de la creme of German publishing. However, the timing was really bad considering the European recession and rising inflation, and frankly, the German public just weren't as obsessive with fashion as the Brits, the French, or the Americans. As such, they struggled to find advertisers for the magazine, cutting its prospective primary revenue source significantly. In order to succeed, it needed to change. Unfortunately, Nast was on hand to oversee that, but it wasn't enough. German Vogue was soon frustrating everyone with their stubborn attitude towards what should and should not be done within their division. Quote, soon enough, however, the New York headquarters ran up against the standard German plaint and response to virtually any business decision. This is not the German way of conducting business, implying naturally that whatever ran counter to German custom was the wrong way. Monthly accounts? This is not the German way. Semi-annual accounts will do just fine. Translating French or English words common to both languages was verboten. Couturier? Don't be silly. Hammerbacher tutted. In German, it will be Schneidermeister, master tailor. And what about the magazine's name? Vogue was un-German. It must be translated simply because everyone would believe that the intention was to call the publication Vogue, one of the German words for wave. And of course, this too would not be the German way. In the end, it was bad timing, bad planning, and stubbornness that killed German Vogue. The company ended up losing $350,000, about 6.5 million today, and they shut before Christmas. Fortunately, however, his other businesses were going well. Carmel Snow had been promoted to fashion editor of Vogue, becoming a very close friend of Condé's. His printing press in Connecticut got a new engraving plant, as did their place in New York. Earnings and sales were massively on the up across the board. He bought a new magazine called The American Golfer, and he also acquired a controlling stake in the Park Lexington Corporation, which owned two very large properties. It's not two properties, it's one, called Grand Central Palace, which was an entire block from Park Avenue to Lexington Avenue. However, all of this was advised on what Waddell Catchings was telling Nast, and it was soon to prove an incredibly foolish series of investments. But for all he knew, his money was at an all-time high and secure in the stock market. It was a flaw of his believe in the person who does the job better than you philosophy. As such, his marital plans continued in the way that they were going, and just 21 days after his son Collier married his fiancée, in fact, on the 28th of December 1928, he finally wed Leslie in her grandfather's home in Aiken, South Carolina. It was a very small affair. Almost no one knew about Condé and Leslie's wedding. The wedding was only announced in the New York Times on Christmas Day in 1928 by Leslie's parents, suggesting it was a last-minute decision, which also explains why neither of his beloved children were present. Afterwards, they headed out on their honeymoon, first to Miami, where they were quickly accosted by the tabloid press trying to get the scoop on a whirlwind wedding. So they ended up going to Nassau, where they met the honeymooning Collier and Charlotte to tell them the news, going on their honeymoon together with their son and daughter-in-law. They were delighted, obviously, and decided to send Venatica so they could all be together on holiday in Nassau together. It was the happiest they had ever been, and Leslie described this time in their lives as a song. By the time that they returned, Condé Nast stock was now at the sky-high price of $80 per share. Soon by that summer, it was $93 per share. Crown & Shield cashed out, but the majority of the investors, Edmund Woolman Pierce and Condé Nast included, stayed on the ride. Carmel Snow, too, had a good portion of her wealth in the stock exchange, as her husband had a seat on it, though it is unclear if she had Condé Nast stock personally. In fact, Nast and Snow grew exceptionally close in this time and were bound to be close, lifelong friends. Soon, she was given the New York editor role of Vogue, a very much earned, huge promotion for a woman who was becoming a very trusted friend and ally. Meanwhile, for Condé, the whole summer was again described as a dream. He felt young and free and rich. He bought a new Rolls Royce to celebrate his marriage, and then a second Rolls Royce when the first accidentally was dropped into the sea because the delivery didn't strap it in correctly. Leslie was also free to stop working at Vogue. She didn't really have any expensive taste, so she wasn't shopping all the time, which was expected of her, but instead, she had just more time to herself, considering she wasn't expected to do any housework, so she was living a very lavish dream life. She soon became pregnant with their first child and began to prepare herself for motherhood in very, very happily wedded bliss. But not everything could be positive forever. And at around the same time, on the 1st of July 1929, his mother, Esther Ariadne Benoit Nast, died in his Sandy Key home in Saint-Point in Long Island, New Jersey. Condé was devastated, but if there was any solace, at least she wasn't around to see the fallout of the October 1929 crash of Wall Street. In late October 1929, between the 24th and the 29th, Goldman Sachs & Company stock fell from $400 to $5. Condé Nast stock fell from $93 to $4.50. Only 18 months after Catchings and Williams convinced Nast to list Condé Nast publications on the stock market. Overnight, Condé Nast had nothing. He lost his controlling stake in his own company, and the stock he did have left was comparatively worthless. Unlike Edna Woolman Chase, he hadn't really invested in property or other stable economies, and unlike Frank Crowninshield, he could not have sold his stock when the price was high. Comparatively to those around him, he was in an awful, awful situation. Catchings and Williams knew this was coming. All of the bankers did. They just chose not to tell him to keep their own interests looking good. They'd prepared their own portfolios, but never in all this time did either man do their job as advisor and inform Nast of the risks that he was taking. It was a calculated tactic to gain more power and, as far as Condé was concerned, to gain control of his company. Effectively, he was betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect him. And now it was his job to turn it round. Condé Nast Publications now was close to worthless, if the stock market was to be believed. But they were still respected in publishing for their technical prowess. All the investments made between 1925 and 1929 had worked in keeping Condé Nast Publications at the very front of luxury magazine publishing. But the loans still weren't yet paid off. He needed more money, and to get that, he needed to take on more debt. Another $2 million to be exact, the equivalent of $38.2 million in 2025. Certainly this was a huge risk, going further into debt to try to save his company, especially at this time when readership was slashed due to the Depression, and equally the vast majority of his advertisers were also going out of business entirely, or equally cash poor and either reducing or entirely cutting their advertising budget for which Vogue, Vanity Fair, and House & Garden relied on so dependently. His bankers and accountants soon grew more vigilant to the ongoings of the company, but they weren't too pleased with what they saw. Nast had been obsessed with product quality, and even at this time would call for tiny details to be fixed, things neither the bankers nor their prospective customers were likely to notice. The bankers didn't care that he was preserving the company's legacy and differentiator. They cared that he was cutting into profits. By early January 1930, merely a month after his borrowing, his bankers started requesting repayments. And then the bills for the renovations at Sandy Key arrived. Condé grew depressed. Neither the birth of his own daughter, Leslie, nor the birth of his first grandson, Peter, whose parents were Condé and Charlotte, could console him. He wrote to his wife, Leslie, on January 28, 1930. Quote, "I feel well enough, but I am depressed and worried. The 1929 circulation reports were not so good for either Vogue, Vanity, or House & Garden, and the competitors up. Their magazines are cutting down our lead in advertising. This has nothing to do with the break in the market. It started before. Moreover, since the break, we appear to be losing more heavily than other magazines." But this actually wasn't true. Condé did feel hopeless, and this was the worst situation he had ever found himself in, but altogether, with the bills to Sandy Key, Nast only owed about $5 million US. His rival at Vanity Fair, William Hearst, owed $120 million, the equivalent of $2.2 billion in 2025. Comparatively, Condé was actually in a far better position. He just didn't realize it. You see, unfortunately, France was also suffering due to the Great Depression, so French Vogue was also one of his worst hit magazines. However, because this business was so well established, as were all the publications across England and France, their ability to provide varied sources of income would soon prove to be the thing that saved his company, even if it didn't look like it yet. Though Nast couldn't see this, as he was mostly preoccupied with trying to figure out how to regain control of his company, which had been slowly slipping out from under him. By December 1930, using their controlling stake of stock, the shareholders elected Sidney J. Weinberg, who was the senior partner at Goldman Sachs & Company, to become the new director of the Condé Nast Publications Incorporated. Condé tried to fight it, he was being pushed out in a sense, but it took an incredible amount of his time, and his company was swept out from underneath him. He started to neglect the attention given to both his wife and his child. Leslie, his wife, was offended. She felt as if it was not only their daughter who was being forgotten, but she also felt forgotten as well. The love and togetherness she had once felt with him had dissipated. She started discreetly seeing another man named Major Reginald, or Rex, Benson, who was much younger. He was athletic, from England, known for his playing of polo and for his family's money. She could have left Condé, but by February 1931, she was given a reason to stay. Condé, at the lowest point in his entire life, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Within days, he was admitted into the Presbyterian Hospital in New York for a radical prostatectomy, but he was likely to survive thanks to the timing of this coinciding with the medical developments of prostatectomies, actually. But his manner was very affected. He became slightly more irritable during the course of chemo that was to follow, and he would also suffer from things like erectile dysfunction and sterility for the rest of his life. Overnight, the procedure cut his options to have more children with his young wife and reduced their ability to enjoy sex. An already depressed man was devastated. Leslie did try to console him, but this was equally as crushing to her as well. Not for the prospect of never having another child, but because this was the last straw that broke the camel's back in terms of his degrading self-perception. Quote, "As far as Leslie was concerned, he was recovering admirably from the condition and they would readjust their horizons accordingly. But her husband still needed persuading. Condé buried himself in work and often sent Leslie and their baby daughter away to give them respite from the cruel hand they had been dealt. Nast could not keep his marriage going while experiencing such stress. A crisis was inevitable. He had married his young wife in the mood of excitement and unreality that swept the country in 1928 and 1929. With his empire dispersed, so were his dreams. Sapped by the ordeals he had to endure in his business life, he could no longer muster the energy or confidence to be a proper, caring husband. In his demoralized state, he grew increasingly distressed by the difference in their ages, and he saw in the cold light of the new world that the marriage had been a hopeless miscalculation. He had given up. He felt he could no longer hold her back from everything she deserved, all of which he just could no longer give her. She loved him, but he loved her too much to let her waste her life. He encouraged her to fall in love again and marry someone more suitable, coincidentally suggesting Major Rex Benson. He was exactly the kind of man he felt Leslie should be with. They were already having an affair, but Condé didn't know, and in fact now approved. They would agree to divorce in October 1931. Condé and Leslie never lost contact and were instead very close for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, too, around the same time in 1931, Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation was sued multiple times for conducting illegal deeds, reporting improper investment funds. Waddell Catchings, Harrison Williams, and Sidney Weinberg were all accused, turning their company into a laughingstock. But it was a laughingstock who unfortunately now controlled the majority stake in Condé Nast Publications. Money was very, very tight. Condé and all of his staff had taken a 10% pay cut in order to keep the company running, the first of two, in fact. He then personally acquiesced to renting Sandy Key out between August 1st and the 15th of January for only $6,000, which is a fraction of what it was worth, just to try and raise some extra funds. And he watched helplessly as his company was passed between companies in the fallout of the crash, unaware of where the needle would drop and who would become the head of the company. By early 1932, a man named Floyd Odium became the director of Goldman Sachs and Company. He also held a controlling stake in Blue Ridge, which is the company to which Nast owed the vast majority of his debt, $4.8 million. Nast's only hope for salvation in this sense was to maintain the success of his magazines. It was basically all he had left. This led to pretty major innovations, however, where Vogue debuted their first bleed page, which is where the ink goes right up to the edge of the paper, so no border, and all of Vogue, Vanity Fair, and House & Garden managed to publish their first color photographs in 1932. This one is from Vogue. Their first color cover photo debuted just 3 months later in July. This obviously cost a fortune, but it did make it look as if Vogue was unaffected by the crash, and perception is everything to the public, so its high cost was very worth it. But also its high cost did nothing to satiate the bankers. It wasn't long before Catchings, who was still going through multiple lawsuits and would be until at least 1933, tried to oust Condé from his own company entirely by offering his role to Edna Woolman Chase. She chastised him instead, and Nast did stay. But Carmel Snow did not. Shortly after her third daughter was born, she defected to Harper's Bazaar. Here, she would make a name for herself, but it came at the cost of her friendship with Condé. It was the second time in his life that he drank. He never forgave her, and he never spoke to her again, causing a seriously deep wound. It could not have come at a worse time. Within just 2 months, the $2 million he managed to borrow in 1929 was now due, but they obviously didn't have it. So he tried to restructure debt, in which case they recovered $750,000. And luckily, his paper supplier, Charles D. Crocker, did supply another $250,000, but this was only half of the money they needed. And yet, finally, his early kindnesses when he had money were about to pay back their karma. You may remember earlier, I told you quite briefly about a beauty that he gave food baskets to when she was a struggling actress. Her name was Edwina Prue, and she'd married the very wealthy Leo d'Allanger, who was an heir to a colossal banking fortune. He had heard about Condé's plight through the grapevine, and to repay the kindness given to his wife, he managed to convince his friend Lord Camrose, who himself owned a huge publishing empire in England, to fulfill the remaining $1 million for him to repay his debt and to repurchase back the shares owned by Blue Ridge. Basically overnight, Condé had his company back. Just not directly. Of the available shares, Camrose retrieved the option to buy 171,000 shares, while Condé was given 40,000 with the option to buy another 40,000 at a later date. Furthermore, Lord Camrose, along with Leo d'Allanger, acting as his banker, gave Nast $300,000 as working capital with no expectation to repay, but on the belief that he was to use it to improve the value of the stock that they now owned. It was effectively a private bailout of the utmost secrecy. Everyone agreed to keep quiet about the rescue. It was in Vogue's best interest. Together, they formed a plan to get rid of Nast's big $4.8 million debt to Blue Ridge Corporation through some corporate reshaping, and Nast was finally allowed the freedom of creativity once more, totally free or almost free of the pressure that the bankers had put on him. Quickly, they saw the fruits of their trust. Quote, Vogue actually made a profit in 1934 of $19,927. His other magazines managed to reduce losses. Both Vanity Fair and the American Golfer were helped by liquor advertising, illegal during Prohibition, and now a greedy space buyer again. They were finally on track to true profit once again. It did, however, mean the closure of Vanity Fair, who was absorbed into Vogue in 1936 and wouldn't resurface again until the 80s. But by the end of 1936, Condé Nast Publications finally showed a profit across the company of $471,363, a massive, massive jump on the minus $208,167 loss they made in the previous year. Both House & Garden and Vogue patterns were improving massively as well, and they shuttered the other unprofitable publication under the umbrella, which was the American Golfer. 1937 was a new year for Condé, wherein he once again found joy in his home life with his child Leslie and his grandchild Peter, who was Couder's kid with Charlotte, whom he had divorced in 1933 before marrying a new woman named Julie Ensley. However, Julie had been especially troubled mentally and spent most of her time in mental sanatoriums because she struggled with her own mortality, and as such, it meant that it was difficult for Couder to care for both Julie and his son Peter simultaneously. Peter could also not go to stay with his mother Charlotte in these short periods of time that he needed him to be elsewhere because she lived in Mexico, and Clarice, who was Peter's paternal grandmother, disapproved of him going to Mexico. Not to matter though, quote, Nast was an attentive and loving grandparent. He wrote Peter letters at school to cheer him up. You know my breakfast menu, I drink a little tea, eat a little toast and honey and large mouthfuls of the New York Times. When I was eating the Times, I took a bite of the weather reports and learnt that at 11:30 there was to be a half-hour shower of turtles. If he agonized over the poor little boy, little Leslie was the light of his days. He took the greatest interest in everything about her, including her clothes, ordering boxes and boxes to be sent to the apartment, and asking women friends to advise on her wardrobe. These were charmed days. Clarice, however, was awful to Leslie. Horrid, in fact. Refusing to let Leslie come out with them if she took Peter out for the day, only coming over if Leslie was absent, refusing to go in rooms if either Leslie, the child, or her mother was present, and purposefully putting down her father in front of her. Condé tried effortfully to keep the peace between grandmother and grandchild, but her behaviour from this point onwards would never change. It was completely baffling behaviour towards a girl of only 6 years old from her grandmother, and only served to make Condé's one single place of solace, his home, equally as exhausting as his workplace. And it was only about to get worse. Condé Nast was largely removed from the goings-on of World War II at this stage. Both Mussolini and Hitler's rise to power were distant threats to Americans. Their homes, however, were both featured somewhat impartisanly in Vogue in 1936, but largely Condé Nast publications, who at this time, I should remind you, had incredibly liberal hiring policies, had published far more anti-Nazi content than neutral, thanks mostly to Claire Booth Brokaw, who had been publishing obviously critical pieces on Germany's entire political system since all the way back in 1933. There was also an incident with Cecil Beaton, whose anti-Semitic notes on his pictures, which he refused to remove and thus were published in 1938, caused him to be very, very publicly fired, and a public statement condemning anti-Semitism was issued, obviously which went against the Nazi ideals. In fact, the first real impact that the war would have on Vogue ended up being when Coco Chanel led a xenophobic speech to the Syndicat de Défense de la Grande Couture Française, which was a company both Condé and Edna had helped to found, that led to a vast amount of their advertisers either straight up refusing Vogue access to their shows or directly pulling out of sponsorship in early 1939. Fortunately, the known Nazi, Coco Chanel, didn't seem to massively hurt the company at this time, only because French Vogue wasn't massively a big moneymaker in those days, and he was seeing far more profit from the other Vogues and Vogue patterns, as well as his new magazine, Glamour of Hollywood, which was a roaring success when that debuted. It also wasn't necessarily a threat that lasted too long anyways, as within just a few months, in September 1939, war was declared. France was invaded by Germany in May 1940, the exact same day that the June edition of French Vogue was going to press. Paper quickly became scarce, and the French government's promise of 150,000 francs had not materialized. The issue never made it to press, and they could not therefore send invoices to their advertisers, losing them an enormous amount of money. On the 22nd of June, France surrendered, and Vogue was now subject to Nazi review. Quote, "It's very important to continue publishing here, or otherwise we risk the seizure of our titles, which would be handed over to any individuals who cared to exploit them." The writing was on the wall. They absolutely would not stand up against Nazi scrutiny. Quickly, Condé Nast got to work ensuring that everyone at risk within their company was safe, and that everyone, to the best of their ability, would continue to be paid during this time, which they confirmed could be paid in full for at least the next 6 months. Most of the at-risk individuals were returned to the New York office for work or to family in other countries. The last at-risk individual evacuated was Walter Mass, the half-Jewish man who had conceived of both British and German Vogue. Condé, obviously very grateful to the man, personally oversaw his visa application, and the last Condé Nast employee was evacuated to Canada just in time to evade imprisonment and persecution, which at this point was the extent at which the wider public knew of Hitler's plans for the Jewish people. Shortly before Mass was evacuated, the propaganda shuffle did confirm that neither French Vogue nor Jardin de Mode could continue to be published in France, obviously due to anti-American sentiments, but also their very clear alignments. Meanwhile, over in Britain, the Blitz had begun and shook the country greatly, which incredibly had the opposite effect and led to the ascension of Audrey Withers, who transformed the magazine into one of the most successful publications in all of British publishing during the war. In fact, she was one of the most important Vogue editors in history for this reason, convincing women to make, do, and mend, and stayed in her role until 1960 when she finally retired. So, Vogue staff was safe, Vogue France was paused, British Vogue was thriving, and the American publications were all continuing nicely. He'd basically survived the outbreak of war with very little happening negatively. However, unfortunately for his son Collier, who was a lawyer in the National Guard, he had been called to service once more, invigorating the very uncomfortable disagreements surrounding his son Peter and turning into much worse cruelties from Clarice. Clarice began fights about his well-being, refused to let him see his mother at all. She became really nasty and vitriolic to those around him. His other grandmother, Mrs. Donald Brown, had to get involved, and eventually Collier, while at war, had to write to his mother to tell her to stop. Unfortunately, however, this situation caused Nast an inordinate amount of stress. It was just something he did not need at this time. And by 1941, his blood pressure rose to an actually dangerous degree. In fact, his blood pressure rose to such an amount that he needed to keep oxygen tanks at home and at the office in order to stay alive. He was lucky that his assistant Mary Campbell was also a trained PE teacher and had taken training on how to care for him at this time. She was the first person in his life who learned about his condition, and she was very caringly discreet. By 1941, only 2 people knew about his condition. That was Mary Campbell, who administered the oxygen in the Condé Nast building, and George Bay, who was his beloved driver that provided the same role but while he was at home. He knew that this blood pressure would lead to his death, and he just didn't want anybody to know, so he secretly kept this to himself and started donating what he had of his wealth to charities. By the end of 1941, his condition had worsened to the degree that his doctors told him it was unrecoverable. December came, and America joined the war. Condé was admitted to hospital, and he received the last radium treatment from his previously diagnosed prostate cancer, which he did need more, but he was just too weak to receive any more chemo. To his son Collier, he told him that he had pneumonia. To the office, he told them that he had an earache. In reality, he had had a heart attack. Regardless, both Leslie and Collier sent their children to his bedside, knowing they would provide him the greatest solace. His grandchild Leslie remained solidly by his bedside when not in school, and Peter visited where possible. He was allowed home for Christmas that year, but it would be his last. Throughout 1942, Condé tried to keep working by preparing his company to continue after his death as best he could. He set up a huge memorandum on how his editorial policies should be continued, how his business should be run entirely. An encyclopedia of his publishing knowledge was very secretly written. He also started to say goodbye to those he was closest to, and he started giving quite good gifts a little more freely in shows of gratitude. He was often late now, often absent from work entirely, in fact. He constantly had a cold or pneumonia, and it made Edna Woolman Chase impatient with trying to work around an unexplained, newly flaky boss. By the time she realized what was going on, he had visibly deteriorated. That summer, he mustered the last of his energy to visit his granddaughter Leslie at summer camp, feigning good health and well-being, going on a hike with her. Here, he had his third and final heart attack. He returned home, and on the 19th of September 1942, at around midday, he passed away at the age of 61. Supposedly, his funeral was held on the same day in the Roman Catholic Church of St. Ignatius, and he was buried next to his beloved mother. 800 people attended his funeral, including most of his closest friends and 400 colleagues. But on such short notice, Collier's beloved son could not attend, and unfortunately even learnt about his father's death over the radio. The company was left in charge of Ivar Patovich as he requested, and his personal estate was split evenly between his children. Though unfortunately that meant that they were just left with a vast amount of debt, which forced them to auction off every single thing of Condé's personal possessions, keeping nothing for themselves, and eventually turning his beloved 1040 Park Avenue home into flats to be sold just so they could absolve his debt. It was a really difficult legacy to leave to the children that he loved so dearly. Fortunately, this is not the thing that he is remembered for today. It did not mar his memory. Instead, he was remembered as not only an exceptional businessman and publisher, a forerunner in so many aspects, discovering the way publishing would be still to this day, but he was also a genuinely great father, grandfather, boss, and friend right until his dying day. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe for more videos like this. If you're interested in similar videos but about the beauty world, do check out my beauty channel here, and a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon for their ongoing support. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.